Welcome to the Microbiome Report. I'm your host, Andrea Wien, and today we're announcing a new monthly segment that we are calling Straight from the Gut. Look, we hear about so many interesting studies, and we are constantly thinking of all of these different ideas that aren't necessarily in-depth enough to do a whole show about. But they're still nonetheless very interesting, and we've been trying to find a way to create a space where we can tell you about them. So in addition to the regular show, we're now going to have a Straight from the Gut episode once a month where we'll talk through these what-if scenarios that we brainstorm and get you up to speed on the latest research that's coming out of the lab. So these shows will really be much less structured, more conversational and free-flowing, but we hope just as insightful and interesting. Joining me on these shows is Afif Ghannoum, the founder and CEO of BIOHM Health. His last name probably sounds a little bit familiar to many longtime listeners. He's the son of Dr. Ghannoum, our favorite resident researcher. So he is very well versed in everything that Dr. Ghannoum is doing at Case Western out of his lab, and really the microbiome space in general. He's privy to a lot of interesting conversations with people who are creating products, working in the lab, working in doctors' offices. So he really brings a rich background and a lot of intel about what's happening in this space. So on this first episode, we dive into how far off we are from personalized nutrition as it relates to the microbiome. When will you be able to go to your doctor, get some of these testing done, and really create something that is meant just for you? Is that something that's in our lifetime? Are we getting close to that? So we discuss that. We also touch on ancient Babylonian diets and talk about them in the context of microbes and what we know or what we don't know about when it comes to the microbes of our ancestors and the ones that we come into contact with every day. Again, this conversation is very freewheeling. It goes a lot of different directions, down a bunch of different rabbit holes, and that is the point. So if you have any topics that you want us to discuss or any questions that you've been noodling about, feel free to send us an email, themicrobiomereport@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out on any of BIOHM Health's social media channels. So you can find them at BIOHM Health across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Again, that's BIOHM if you're looking for that. All right, let's jump in. Afif, what's up? How you doing?
I'm good. It's been one of those crazy weeks, a lot going on. We're obviously, we do microbiome data testing, so we're starting to go through the data, and we're seeing some really cool things from like the autism microbiome trial we did. So, one of the things everybody talks about is the connection between the microbiome and various different conditions, and we're really, really seeing it in the data, so we're going to be publishing our autism data, but we do this really cool, we have a computer scientist, I sound like a dad talking about the Facebook, we have a scientist who is at IBM Watson, and we basically were like, here's all the data we've been collecting, we have tens of thousands of tests, like, tell us what you're seeing in data, like, can we see different things? And he applied these machine learning models, which I barely understand, but basically, we always hear about AI and machine learning, right? So what does that mean? So my understanding is that a lot of this data that we collect, like from, not just microbiome, but I mean just in general, it's almost worthless if you can't apply machine learning to actually make sense of it, right? So for example, in our database, we have a lot more women than men that have taken the test. Kind of makes sense because, frankly, women take better care of themselves. They want to understand what's going on. So the problem is it's really hard to analyze that data because there's a big imbalance, right? So like this guy has spent months sort of analyzing the data and really balancing it out using machine learning so that the data all of a sudden doesn't look so tipped one way. And he started doing that with these different data sets we have for like lactose intolerance, autism. And, if you and I were just looking at the data before he analyzed it, you'd be like, oh, it kind of looks like just a blob of dots. So he applies it, and Andrea, the stuff just explodes out. And all of a sudden you can see like blue cluster of dots that are people with autism and red cluster of dots, people without autism, and they're completely different, right? So it's really fascinating to look, okay, well, there are clearly differences. So how can we now bridge that gap, right? And what does that mean, right? So take autism. people with autism tend to have pretty severe digestive issues. Not all, but a lot do, right? So the question is, what I've learned is that a lot of people with autism, they're very picky eaters, right? Diet-wise. So then it becomes a question of like, well, is it becoming self-fulfilling that there's a microbiome difference because of the way diet comes into play, or is it actually to do with autism? So there's a lot to unpack in this stuff, but it's really, really interesting to kind of dive in, because there's clearly differences in microbiome of people with various conditions and people without. But now it's like, okay, well, what can we actually do with that?
Yeah, last time I was at your dad's lab at Case, he actually showed me some of those charts, and it's really startling. Like you're saying, you can very clearly see, the people who have autism and the people who don't. And he said, even just by looking at these charts, I can tell just by looking at that. I don't have to know any of their symptoms. I don't have to know any of their history, just by looking at the microbes that they have. And the question that I asked is exactly the one that you just posed. Like, is the autism spectrum disorder causing the dysfunction, or is the dysfunction there first and then that's causing some of the other problems? And that'll be so interesting to dig into, because really you can come up with so many more therapeutic solutions if you know that you can alter certain microbes to change the composition of what's happening in the body, which, we know from the mind-body connection and the gut-brain connection, but yeah.
Well, what's cool is so we always talk about it in the context of conditions, but it's not just conditions, right? So it's like right now, if you are like a 50 plus adult and you want a supplement, like there's a bunch of like, age specific multivitamins, right? But really, and I don't honestly know, but I imagine those were designed just with sort of generalities, right? What's really cool about the potential of this data, and we're not there yet, but this is where we're headed, is, we can literally look in our data and say, okay, I wonder if there's a difference between the microbiome of a 50 plus woman and a 30-year-old woman, right? And we can look and see, okay, well, what are those differences? Are there certain organisms that, degrade as you get older? Are there ones that, for people that get really old are present in people that, are only 50, right? And then can we actually use that to design products that can help the 50-year-old woman, her gut look more like a 30-year-old woman, right? Like that's where it gets really interesting. We can do it even with like diet. Like, what does the microbiome of a vegan look like versus someone who's a meat eater, right? And does it make a difference, right? That's the secondary part. So what I would say is, especially microbiome data generally, the way to think about it is we're like where cancer research was in like the 70s, right? Like we understand some things going on, but there's a lot of work to do, right? So, and that's where like sometimes I get wary in the industry of like people will make giant leaps in what these connections mean, right? And so it's that old like correlation versus causation. It's really interesting.
Yeah, there's so many pieces that you've kind of brought up that I want to touch on. So it's going to sound maybe a little bit erratic, but the first one is you mentioned that, mostly women are taking the gut testing kit, which is so unique because women historically have been underrepresented in science and in science research. And so to have that wealth of data on something like the microbiome that's so cutting edge, and to have it be mostly women, although I recognize the benefits of doing, the data analysis to be able to level that playing field. So we're looking at all populations, but to even have that raw data for women is something that's very unique. So that's one point that I think is interesting.
But it's funny you say it, like literally, and this is off topic of the microbiome, but like even in sexual health, I was just talking about this. There's a lot of articles about how, when it comes to, I know what it was. There's a guy who does some really interesting collaboration stuff with Dad at Case. He's really big urologist in the space. And he's saying like, listen, even in sexual health, there's very little research that's been done for women versus men. Right. And it's just when you start looking at like sort of, not to again sound like the 40-year-old dad, but when you start coming like woke to some of this stuff, like, why is that? Why, but when, sort of citizen science, which we're not like, obviously, like we run a business, right? So it's not just like science for science sake, but when we're sort of putting clinical testing in the hands of people, And guess what? It's women coming forward, to your point, and saying, well, I want to know what's going on, right? I want to understand where I'm at. So it's really interesting. Like, you can't, even science, which I've grown up my entire life around science, like it's not unbiased, right? Like, just like you're saying, like a lot of the issues in the science that even clinical trials, again, we're kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but like a lot of people in clinical trials, it weighs Caucasian, right? It's not a general, demographic, but even tying it back to the microbiome, here's the really cool potential in microbiome. So a lot of people, like, do you ever get headaches?
Rarely, but yeah, I got them a lot when I was pregnant, which is interesting in microbiome because we know the microbiome changes so much in pregnancy, which, it goes back to your point of, do you have different microbiomes at different life stages? And I think the answer has to be yes.
Yeah. So let's say like you get headaches, and, for me, like I used to get awful migraines, and then I found out a leaf, like just over the counter leaf, is the only thing that will work for me. Why? I have no idea. Right. But what's funny is, like, when we take a drug, we just assume like, well, this drug will work for whatever it's for, like headache, pain, knee pain, something, right? But what a lot of people don't realize is that for every drug, there's a population of people that are called non-responders. The drug just doesn't work for them, right? And we don't quite know why, right? And it's a big problem in clinical trials, because in clinical trials, a clinical trial can end up failing because you accidentally have too many non-responders to the drug. So it's not that the drug doesn't work, it's that for this type of person, for whatever reason, they just don't metabolize it right. Something's going on. Now, how this ties to the microbiome is, and this blew my mind, is that my dad's doing a lot of this work. They've identified that your microbiome can impact how well you metabolize certain drugs. Right? So that's important, because what you will end up probably seeing is, when they're doing these drug trials for drug approvals, they'll actually screen people's microbiomes to weed out people that are likely to not be drug responders. You see what I'm saying? So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really amazing how tied into everything our gut is, So like, think about that. Like, you could literally just have never gotten the right dose of an over-the-counter medicine that, how many, like, there's stuff for me, like, I'm like, it just doesn't work for me. Well, it might be like, I just don't need the regular dose. I need like a different dose because I'm a microbiome non-responder for that type of a drug class, right? So, we are probably headed towards not only way more understanding that, but like where these things start to edge towards true personalization, which, like, you and I are now keeping a sort of a running list of topics to cover, right? And that's why I was putting personalized nutrition, like, is it real, as a topic to cover? But like, that's where I think, the real potential of microbiome is to really help, sort of hone in on what are these things that impact the way my health is impacted, medication-wise, food-wise, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I actually hand out a handout to people who take a lot of NSAIDs, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Like, these are like the aspirin, Aleve, Advils of the world, to my clients who are taking a lot of these, because it can increase intestinal permeability. We know it changes the composition of gut flora, and it can cause serious complications over the long term for exactly this reason that you're talking about. And, some of those mechanisms are not so clear yet. We're still learning what that looks like, but something as innocuous as taking an Advil can really, over the long term, have impacts on the microbes that are in there. So whether that's because
might stop that drug from being effective. That's the
exactly
wildest part to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, so we may have had drugs that failed in clinical trials, never got to market, because the people in the clinical trial just were never going to respond to that type of a drug. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, that's where it's like, wow, that's insane,
Yeah. And so then when we talk about personalized nutrition, it's like, in your opinion, how far off are we from personalized medicine and from people going to their doctor and getting like a full workup done of gut microbes and whatever else they might be struggling with, and then having a doctor be able to turn around and create something with a manufacturer or someone else that is targeted to that person?
Yeah, so in the industry, like wellness industry, personalized nutrition is like the buzzword of all buzzwords, right? Like people love this idea, like, can you give people exactly something made for them, right? So where I fall on it is I think we're pretty far off of that, and it might not be a big deal ultimately, but I think we're pretty far off of it for two reasons. One, the logistics are extremely tricky, right? Like it is very hard. And there's some companies that have tried this, but for you in a way that's not going to cost $500, give you something personalized to you, it's very tricky to do that at scale, right? And when, the closest they've gotten with personalization, there's a lot of these sort of quiz-based personalized, and you'll talk to 10 people about them and you'll get 15 different opinions. I personally don't think that's like true personalization. I think it's sort of classification, like you're closer to this, right? But it's not actually based on you. It's based on you answering questions that sort of throw you into general buckets, So I think we're pretty far off. But it might not actually matter, right? Because especially in microbiome, what we've seen is, when we analyze people, microbiome is a little bit like a fingerprint, right? Like that's what people think, at least. What we think is that what the data has shown us is that you're more likely to fall in one of a handful of clusters. And so even getting you into one of these clusters and giving you, nutritional solutions or even potentially medications based on that cluster is probably for 99% of people going to be a giant jump from where they're at. I don't know that extra like last piece of personalization is going to end up being worth the cost, and that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I don't actually think we're anywhere near that. And we may not end up needing to be near that.
And I think the medical model would have to change so drastically, when we have doctors who are meeting with patients for, let's say, 6 minutes at a time or 4-minute appointments versus when you look at some of the functional medicine doctors, they're meeting with patients for an hour to 2 hours. So that seems like a more sustainable route if we were going to move into personalized nutrition, to have more time with the patient, just more face time and trust.
So not as much anymore, but like a few years ago, my dad, we were approached by literally like sort of billionaire types that had read about his research, saw what we were doing. They're saying, like, could you give me like true one-on-one concierge from, and the way this one guy put it, he's kind of like a Bruce Wayne type. Like he said, just analyze me from the microbiome out, right? And so we actually paired up with a very big functional medicine physician. And so my dad and this guy actually divided and conquered. My dad analyzed microbiome, analyzed nutrition, and then functional medicine physician put him through an enormous battery of tests, right? So for us to go through all of his results, it was pretty wild. Like the guy flies in, into the Burke Airport here in Cleveland, like, private, comes right to a hotel, and then for like 2 days, going like step by step through all the results, and even that, the recommendations at the end were, they were personalized, but they weren't like, here are powders made up for you. Do you see what I'm saying? So like, to be able to do that level of true personalization, it's so involved, right? Like,
and not scalable. I mean, I just am thinking it's like, it's so cost prohibitive. It's not scalable. We talk about equity in the wellness space, like certainly basically the farthest end of the spectrum away from that as you could get.
Yeah. So it just opened my eyes, like, oh my God, like this is the closest you're going to get, like super expensive, like super high touch. And it took days to go over all these results. You know what I mean? It's really been, kind of cool to see some of these things. But yeah, on the personalization front, I think, and I think the dirty secret is, and we see this in the data, is that for a lot of people, unfortunately, like we live in society, everybody wants a silver bullet, right? Like if I just know this, or I take this, my issue will be solved, right? So a lot of times, when we see people taking the microbiome test, there's very low hanging fruit things they can be doing to optimize their gut that they're not doing, right? Like they're eating fast food, they're eating a lot of processed foods.
They're smoking, not getting enough sleep. Yeah, all these basics.
Stressed, right? And so, we always look at this like, this is a lot of effort and energy to take one of these tests. Like you don't probably need to, if you just took care of a few of these things. Like the analogy I always give is like, we've all been stuck in traffic behind the guy on a carbon fiber bike, wearing a Lycra suit, amazing aerodynamic helmet, and he's 80 pounds overweight. And you're like, you don't need that carbon fiber bike or the Lycra suit. Like, if you just lost some weight, that would make you better at cycling, right? So it's the same kind of analogy where, we're not going to find that you're missing some rare type of fungi, and if we just help you get that, you'll be in great shape. It's like, you have to manage some of these other things,
I think the closest that we have to this is some of these specialized elimination diets, for lack of a better term. The GAPS diet that was created by Dr. Campbell McBride. I mean, that really targets, like, to bring it back to what we were talking to earlier, autism, ADHD, kind of this, it's the gut and psychology diet. So it's, getting your gut in a place where that brain gut connection is functioning better. And we really see amazing results with that. And so to your point of putting people, more into a bucket, it's not personalized per se, but it may be personalized enough for what you're struggling with. Or ketogenic, we see ketogenic now for weight loss, which is not what it was originally designed for. It came out to help with seizures in children that were unresponsive to medication. Or, now it's being used for targeting some different cancer therapies and things like that. So you have these diets that you really can change so much of what's going on in the gut and in the body. Again, not personalized, but personalized enough to make a huge difference.
Yeah. And listen, we will continue to make incremental changes, right? Like I was actually joking with someone the other day about, I was at the grocery store, and my son, we don't buy any of the stuff we would buy as kids, like, sugary cereals, all those kind of things. And he saw like Fruit Loops or one of these type of like cereals from our childhood, right? And it was so amazing to see like just that marketing effect work on him, right? But I was telling my friend, like, what's wild is not really purposefully, but just like incrementally, like the things that were just like quote unquote food when we were young, like powdered lemonades, these types of cereals, all sorts of chips, like all sodas, we just don't have those in the house anymore. And I feel like a lot of people don't have those in the house anymore, right? And it was just slow incremental change where by the time we became parents, like we're not doing those things, right? It's almost becoming taboo, right? So that only happens slowly. So I think the same thing's going to end up happening in, we're even 2015, 2016, when we really got into this. Like some of the things we're talking about, you really only saw in like sort of the Mind Body Greens, Well and Good Goops world, right? Of sort of these really high touch wellness, right? You're starting to see that seep into true mainstream, right? So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I think, people get very kind of down and out a lot about the state of the food industry, which I do too. I think, there's a lot of work to do, but I think you can look at organic as a way to, bolster the reserves, if you will, or bring some optimism to the table. Like, 20 years ago, people were saying like, oh, organic could never be anything more than a specialty store, that only the weird hippies go to. And now you can find organic foods at Walmart, and not that doesn't have its own set of issues. We don't need to get into that, but, people voted with their dollars and we are where we are now. And so I think you're right. It happens slowly, but it gives me a lot of hope that a lot of people are raising their kids without the Fruit Loops and the Pringles of the world, at least on a regular basis. Those are treat foods, not regulars.
It really, no, totally. And and to that point, so I heard on actually the Joe Rogan podcast, Gabby Reese, I think she said, I explained to my kids, like those things that are really tasty, right? That's fun. It's not food. So as long as you think of it that way, and I'm like, you know what, that's a really interesting way to think about it. So when you said that, like a treat, I thought that was useful.
Yeah. And I think it helps to, to not be so militaristic about what you're giving your kid all the time, because then, they're going to go back the other way and that's all they're going to want to eat. So, you'll have undone the good work that you've put in at the beginning.
If you talk about this, but a lot of it really comes down to like the most boring thing in the world, which is just like moderation, right? Like one time I was at a conference and we were presenting our results and I was explaining how we've talked about the fact that we have this sort of cohort of women that they were having very aggressive fungi building in their guts, right? And it was called zygomycota, right? And so we would typically only see that fungi growing in people who are immunocompromised, like literally like cancer, HIV, right? So there were enough of these people though that we thought something else is up here. And what we found was that when they totally cut out carbs and they totally cut out dairy, those are great sort of gut-friendly foods. And that was allowing this fungi to grow out of control, right? So I was at this conference and I was explaining that hey, like dairy actually it might not be as bad as it seems for people that don't have obviously lactose issues, right? And this woman like bit my head off, right? She was like sort of very pro-vegan and she like identified as that like at the conference. And I was trying to make the point to her, like, listen, I'm not saying like average American, the amount of dairy they have is enormous, right? But the problem is like saying reducing that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to zero. So I think that's the problem is we found some dairy was actually helpful, but not sort of meaning you can just have all the ice cream in the world you want, right? So like a lot of these things, it's being mindful about what you're doing and doing it in moderation, which is so boring, but
yeah, but it's true. And there's different variations on dairy, right? Like you could be having, like you're saying, the ice cream or the very sugary yogurt that's packaged as a health food, but really has like 40 grams of sugar in a serving. Or you could be having like good, high quality, high fat dairy that's from the farm and grass fed and all those types of things that will be really supportive for health. Like you're saying, if you don't have an issue with lactose. So I think we lump again things into one category and label them as good or bad when really within that category, there's a huge spectrum and variation on what could be considered healthful or not.
Yeah. And I think it's frustrating for people because to your point, like people start actually feeling bad, right? Because they're trying to make these great choices. Seem to be like a million, should I be having this source of vitamin C? Should I be having that? Like it's literally overwhelming. And I think one of the things we don't do well as an industry is make it simple to understand the basics of really, this is what you need. Now, part of it's just the dynamic of like, companies need to come out with the latest and greatest and try this because we have this new sort of thing, but I think for consumers, it ends up making a lot of people that are really earnest to eat well, take care of themselves. It ends up being sort of, I don't want to say dire, but like we have people that when they talk to our nutritionist, they have angst, right? Because they want to eat well, they want to be doing what they should, but they're so overwhelmed by the information and the latest and greatest that, I almost wonder if we're going to have like, especially after COVID, where, you started to realize what you really do need and what you don't, and what's available at the grocery store. Like it'd be interesting to see if we kind of have a back to basics a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with that have emailed me or texted me, after we've kind of gone through their initial plan and said, well, I read this article that X is supposed to be great for this. Like, should I be eating that? And it's like, well, to your point, the silver bullet, like you're not going to eat avocados and suddenly everything's going to be fine, Right. So yes, maybe that's part of the plan in a larger scale, but you can't expect to take one supplement or a handful of supplements, which I see, laundry lists coming in, like people are taking, 20 supplements a day. And it's like, okay, let's scale this back and see, what are we really taking these for? What can we replace with food and how can we get back to basics and that moderation that we were talking about? Because really that's where most people will thrive.
Yeah, and like something my dad and I always say is that dietary supplements should be a supplement to your diet, right? Like you're not going to take a pill. You're not like, to your point, like 14 pills away from perfect health. Those things are only supposed to be, adjuncts to what you're doing with your diet. And what we see is like a lot of people, their eating is a mess, right? They're just not eating well, or they eat well, but they drink heavily, or there's this one woman my dad always talks about, right, where she was like beside herself dealing with digestive issues. And when you look, she's like, I don't know what else I can be doing. Like I'm eating well, I take all these products, and then the part that she sort of overlooked and again, one of our nutritionists honed in on was she identifies as like severely stressed, right? And so, again, that's one of the things that is frustrating about the space that makes it interesting is it truly is multifactorial. There's so many aspects that you have to be, juggling in order to really feel better and be at sort of optimal wellness, that, it can be really frustrating for people. And that's something like, for me, that's sort of the next challenge I'm looking at, like as someone in this space, like how do you make this stuff not just accessible, but like useful,
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the goal of this whole show. And we've done so many episodes now on these different facets that we've talked about: stress and sleep and gut brain connection. And it all comes back to what we're talking about now. And so, people who are interested in learning about those other facets, certainly go back and listen to some of our past episodes, and we'll have more on the horizon. But yeah, I mean, it really does come back to that all the time.
So some of these other things you were putting on the list, let's pick one of these other ones. Which one of these do you think is worth taking a look at?
I think this is an interesting what if. So this guy recreated these meals from 1750 BC. So he went back and got these old scrolls and essentially recreated all of these foods. And it got me thinking, we talk a lot on the show about the hygiene hypothesis and how we've lost a lot of the microbes that our ancestors had. And we just talk about, in terms of like immigration and travel, how people in different countries that are eating different foods, different indigenous diets and things like that, have so many different diversity of microbes than we do here in America, especially. And so it got me thinking, like, what if we could eventually somehow mine those microbes and recreate meals from the past that featured them? Like, how would our bodies react? Have we evolved to a point that we can't even know yet in science, far away from what our ancestors were eating, that would completely throw us for a loop? Like, what would that look like? It got me just kind of going down that what if rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, you kind of tap into a bigger point, which I think is like, it blew my mind when I kind of really understood it, is that, and I'll use COVID as an example, right? So you're talking about like ancient organisms. When we talk about probiotics, it seems like, oh my God, there's so many different strains I could be taking. Like, the reality is, I'm just ballparking this, but like, we've probably tapped into like 1/100th of, if even that, of the probiotic organisms that actually exist out there that could be helpful to us, right? So like, why do I mention COVID? COVID, the big problem with it is that, whatever the origin was, like bats or like wet markets, we sort of unleashed this novel virus that we weren't used to, right? And so, one of the things that they talk about, like, is scary, is that, our bodies have not been exposed to it, and, all the consequences we've seen, right? But the exact same phenomena, not only with viruses, but with bacteria, fungi, there are so many organisms out there we're not even aware of yet, right? So like, going to your point, like about ancient's super interesting, but to me, it's also mind-boggling that even now there are organisms we're not even aware of that could be helpful, right? And so if you think about it, like just with COVID, there's sort of like good organisms out there that, either we'll find through mining. This one company, they created their novel probiotics. Do you know what they did? They found basically uncontacted tribes, I believe in Africa, and they sequenced their guts, and they found organisms that the rest of us had not really been exposed to. So going back to ancient organisms, so they found these novel strains from these uncontacted tribes, so it's a little bit.
Did they work? Did they have different impact? Yeah. So that's interesting to me. Like, are there? I mean, this goes back to a couple different episodes that we've done. William Parker, we were talking about helminths, which are intestinal worms, and saying like, we've gotten rid of all of these worms in our system, but actually the human body and the immune system evolved to have those. And similarly, we talked about that with viruses with Dr. Dennis Carroll. So we've evolved to have these things around, and we've inadvertently or very intentionally, depending on which way you look at it, killed them off. And now, we're struggling with a bunch of other issues on the other side. So it's like, there are things out there that we're not even aware could be helpful. So I think, talking to Dr. William Parker, it's like, we even know some of these things, and we're trying to figure out now how to bring them back in a way that, the FDA will approve of, let's say. But it's also a game of numbers. Like, we know now from his research and other people's research that if you put too many of them into someone, then they have severe distress in the digestive tract versus, doing it more slowly can have a better impact. So I think that's also where this will go. And, you brought up COVID, like people automatically, I think, are in the mind space of where we were with bacteria, like all viruses are bad. And now we know with bacteria, like that's not the case. We have this symbiotic relationship. There's good, there's bad. It's, it's too black and white to label them that. But I think viruses for people are still in that place of very black and white, good or bad. And they're all bad. People are always saying like, they're just all bad. And I don't think we can say that yet. And then it brings me to thinking too, like, okay, let's say, that maybe we do find some ancient microbes that we can put into a supplement. Will those even take hold? Are they going to be very similar to like our modern day probiotics, which are more transient in nature and can help in the short term? Or are they really going to take hold in the gut and create a different ecosystem there? Like, these are all questions too.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's once you find a strain that's interesting in the lab, there's so much more to get to see if it will actually, and I'm trying to find more information on that strain I was just talking about. But even if a strain like this actually has some interesting effect on, biofilms or something, right, that we always talk about, there's a gigantic difference between that working in the lab and it being something that we can manufacture at scale.
Okay, cool. Well, Afif, I think this was so much fun just to kind of go down these rabbit holes with you. And we'll certainly put out calls if anyone has questions even now that, they want us to dig into. Feel free to send us an email, the Microbiome Report @gmail.com, or hit us up on any of the social channels and we can add those to the list. But we're going to just be in this space every month now, going through some of these what ifs and going through some of the latest research. We'll certainly be excited to see as the autism research continues with your dad, Dr. Ghannoum. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on to chat.
Thanks for having me. This is actually really fun.
Yeah, have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
As always, thanks so much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed this new segment called Straight from the Gut. We'll be back with another episode of the Microbiome Report. As always, you can find the episodes with our guests on Thursdays, the first Thursday of every month. And then this episode will be either the third or the fourth Thursday of every month, depending on how many weeks of that month there are. So please tune back in. Of course, you can always follow us and all of the past episodes by going to biohmblog.com and clicking on the podcast tab. Again, BIOHM. And as always, I'm Andrea Wien. Until next time, stay safe.